My name is Vanessa Holloway, a 4-year-old compliance analyst. And the night my parents humiliated me in front of 21 people was the night everything finally made sense. It happened at a long family dinner at my Aunt Lorraine's house, where every seat had already been decided before anyone arrived. And mine, halfway down the table, beside two distracted teenagers, told me exactly where I stood before a word was spoken. Mason sat near the head, close to my father, close to the center of attention, while my mother moved around him with quiet, deliberate care, adjusting plates, refilling his glass, touching his shoulder, as if he were the reason the evening existed. By the time dessert was served, my father tapped his glass with a knife, and the entire table went still in that familiar, practiced way families have when something important or controlled is about to be said. He stood up slowly, one hand on the chair, and announced that he wanted to make a family decision clear. Then he said it. The education fund that had been set aside for me, $78,000 my grandfather had promised, would be used for my graduate school, was being redirected to support Mason's restaurant expansion. He spoke as if it were strategy, not theft. As if moving my future into my brother's business was a rational reallocation, not a public erasure. My mother followed immediately, her voice softer but sharper. "She doesn't need it," she said, glancing at me briefly before turning back to the table. "Vanessa is stable. Mason is building something real. We have to invest where it matters." There was a pause. Not shock, just discomfort. People shifting in their chairs, lowering their eyes, pretending neutrality. Then my father added the line that settled everything. "We're not wasting that kind of money on something that won't grow." The words landed clean. Too clean. No one defended me. Not my aunt. Not my uncle. Not even my grandmother, who had been there the day the fund was first discussed. Mason kept his eyes on his plate, letting the moment pass over him like something he had nothing to do with. I felt every gaze turn toward me, waiting for a reaction. But I didn't give them one. I reached for my glass, took a small sip of water, and set it back down carefully before speaking. My voice even, controlled, almost detached. "How much of it is still there?" That wasn't what they expected. My father hesitated, just slightly. "It's handled," he said. "You don't need to worry about it." "I didn't ask that," I replied. A few heads lifted. My mother's expression tightened. Just for a second. "This isn't the time, Vanessa. You made it the time." The sentence stayed in the air longer than it should have. Not loud, not emotional, but precise enough that no one could ignore it. My father sat down. Mason finally looked up, but only briefly. My mother folded her hands together, as if she could smooth the moment back into something acceptable. "It's family money," my father said, quieter now. "We decide how it's used." I nodded once, slowly, as if accepting it. Understood. That was all. Conversation resumed in pieces. Forced. Uneven. Everyone trying to move past what had just happened without acknowledging it. My mother began talking about Mason's expansion plans. My father laughed louder than necessary. Someone asked about real estate. The twins beside me went back to their phones. I stayed long enough to confirm one thing. No one was going to stop this. Not tonight. When I finally stood to leave, my mother followed me into the hallway, lowering her voice the way people do when they know they've crossed a line but don't intend to step back. "You'll be fine," she said. "You always are. Mason needs this more." I put on my coat and looked at her. Really looked at her, noticing how certain she was. How completely she believed the story she had just told. "That's not the problem," I said quietly. She frowned, not understanding. I didn't explain. Outside, the night air was still warm. I sat in my car for a moment without starting it, replaying the dinner not emotionally, but structurally. What was said? What wasn't? Who reacted? Who didn't? Then I opened my phone and typed a short list. Education account. Exact balance. Control authority. Transfer timing. I stared at the screen for a second longer. then added one more line. Who signed it? I didn't cry. I drove home, changed, and opened my laptop before midnight. Within an hour, I had pulled up the original estate email from my grandfather's attorney, the one that outlined the purpose of the fund in exact language. It wasn't vague. It wasn't flexible. And it definitely wasn't theirs to redirect without consequence. By 12:47 a.m., the shape of the situation had already shifted. What happened at dinner wasn't just betrayal. It was a move they believed was already protected. That night didn't end when I closed my laptop, because the structure behind what happened at dinner kept unfolding the longer I looked at it, each detail aligning with a level of precision that made it impossible to mistake this for a spontaneous decision or even careless management. Atet. Tolva. M. I reopened the archived estate email from my grandfather's attorney and followed the attachment chain more carefully than I had the first time, tracing not just the summary, but the updated trust language that had been issued 3 years after his passing, when my father consolidated several family-held accounts under what he described as simplified oversight, a phrase that now read less like efficiency and more like control. The wording had not changed in the way he seemed to believe it had, because the clause that mattered was still intact, clearly stating that the $78,000 allocated under my name was restricted to education-related use, including tuition, licensing, or advanced certification, with discretionary authority applying only to the timing of release, not the purpose of the funds, a distinction that most people would overlook, but one that defined the entire boundary of what could and could not be done. That was the first point where the narrative he presented at dinner began to separate from the structure he was operating within. Because delaying access could be justified, but redirecting the purpose required something he did not mention, and more importantly, something he had not asked for. At 1:36, I accessed the public filing records tied to the family LLC, the same entity my father had repeatedly told me I wouldn't understand, because it involved operational decisions and capital structuring, which in practice meant nothing more than documented entries, timestamps, and signatures arranged in a way that either held under scrutiny or didn't. Mason's restaurant entity had submitted an amended operating agreement 11 days earlier, and the document itself was clean on the surface, formatted correctly, filed on time, and structured to look like a standard internal capital adjustment. But the line that mattered sat in the middle of the page, understated and easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. A $75,000 contribution, categorized as a family-backed discretionary capital infusion, with no reference to origin beyond that phrase. It was not listed as a loan, which would have required repayment terms, and it was not listed as external equity, which would have required disclosure of ownership dilution. And more importantly, it did not acknowledge that the source of the funds was restricted under a separate agreement tied to a named beneficiary. I read the number again, slower this time, because the difference was small enough to pass unnoticed but large enough to matter. 75,000, not 78. $3,000 unaccounted for. That kind of discrepancy does not come from rounding or administrative fees, and it does not disappear without leaving a trace somewhere in the sequence of movement, which meant the transfer had been staged in parts rather than executed in a single transaction. At 2:04 a.m., I checked the submission timestamp on the amendment, and the exact time 4:18 p.m., the afternoon before the dinner, shifted the entire frame of the situation, because it confirmed that what I had witnessed was not a decision being made in real time but a decision that had already been executed, with the dinner functioning as a controlled announcement designed to create the appearance of transparency after the fact. The order mattered. The transfer had already occurred. The announcement followed. The justification came last. Once that sequence was clear, the tone at the table made more sense, because they were not negotiating with me. They were managing my reaction to something they believed was already beyond reversal. At 2:27, I pulled up my own message history and located the last conversation I had with my father about the fund, which had taken place 6 months earlier when I mentioned applying for a certification program that required an initial deposit. And his response short, dismissive, and framed as financial caution stated that the account was not liquid yet, a claim that now stood in direct conflict with the speed and timing of the transfer that had just been executed. That contradiction removed the possibility of misunderstanding. What remained was intent. By 3:10, I shifted focus to Mason's business filings, not out of curiosity but necessity. Because if the money had been moved into his operation, then the condition of that operation would explain the urgency behind the transfer, and within minutes the pattern became visible through publicly available records that required no interpretation beyond basic reading. A supplier lien filed 4 weeks earlier for $42,600. A notice of late lease obligations, totaling $18,200 across 2 missed payments. And a pending vendor dispute that had not yet escalated but had been formally documented. The numbers aligned too precisely to ignore, because they explained why the transfer amount stopped at $75,000 instead of $78,000, and they explained why the language at dinner focused on expansion rather than recovery. This was not growth capital. It was stabilization. The education fund had not been invested. It had been used to absorb a deficit. I closed the documents and sat back. Not reacting emotionally but recalibrating. Because the situation was no longer defined by what had been taken, but by how it had been taken, and where the pressure points now existed within the structure they believed was secure. What I had in front of me was not evidence in the formal sense. It was alignment. Alignment between documents, timing, and intent. And alignment creates leverage when applied correctly. The next morning, I went to work without changing anything in my routine, because visibility would come later, and only when it served a purpose. While for now, consistency allowed me to observe without being observed in return. At 11:18 a.m., my mother sent a message, suggesting we talk before this becomes something unnecessary, which confirmed she understood there was risk, but had not yet identified where it was located. And I left it unanswered, because engagement at that stage would only shift attention without creating advantage. Mason called shortly after noon, and I let it go to voicemail, listening only once to confirm the tone, which was uncertain but not informed, as he offered a vague assurance that the money would be returned once things stabilized, a phrase that indicated he believed time, not structure, would resolve the situation. He was wrong. At 12:20 p.m. During a break, I reviewed my own financial position, not because it was directly connected to the transfer, but because it defined my operating range, confirming that I held no shared liabilities, no co-signed obligations, and no dependency that could be leveraged against me, which meant any move I made would be structurally independent. That mattered more than anything else. That evening, I laid out the documents again. This time not to search, but to organize, separating what was assumed from what was verifiable, until only one line required attention. Funds may not be repurposed for non-educational use without explicit written consent of the named beneficiary. I read it once, then again, not for meaning but for confirmation, because the clause did not leave room for interpretation. And more importantly, it did not include any alternative pathway that allowed for implied consent or post-action approval. They had not asked, which meant they had not obtained it. And without that, the transfer, no matter how clean it appeared within the LLC structure, remained incomplete at a level that could not be ignored once brought into the right context. I turned off the light and left the documents where they were, not because I was finished, but because the next step required movement, not analysis. And movement only works when the timing is precise. The pressure had already started building. They just didn't know where yet. By the next morning, I stopped looking for more information and started testing what I already had. Because the difference between suspicion and leverage is not how much you know, but whether the system responds when you touch it. At 9:14 a.m., before my first meeting, I drafted a single email to the estate attorney who had handled my grandfather's trust, not as a confrontation but as a clarification request, carefully phrased to avoid accusation while forcing a precise answer to a narrow question. Whether a restricted education allocation under a beneficiary designation could be repurposed without written consent if the managing party claimed discretionary authority over timing. I attached the original clause. I did not mention my parents. I did not mention Mason. At 10:02, I received an automated acknowledgement confirming receipt and assigning a case reference number, which was expected, but what mattered was that the inquiry now existed outside the family structure, logged, time-stamped, and visible to someone whose role required accuracy rather than loyalty. That was the first shift. At 11:36, I initiated the second. Using the same LLC filing portal my father relied on, I requested a full transaction disclosure tied to the amended operating agreement, selecting the audit access option that allowed a registered beneficiary of a connected trust to review funding sources when a capital contribution originated from a restricted account, a provision most people ignore because it is rarely used and even more rarely challenged. The request itself did not accuse anyone of wrongdoing. It simply required the system to confirm whether the declared source of funds matched the legal conditions attached to it. If it didn't, the discrepancy would not remain internal. It would be flagged. Bid 12:08 p.m. I received confirmation that the request had been accepted and queued for processing, with a standard review window of 3 to 5 business days, which would have been slow under normal circumstances but was already faster than the timeline my father assumed he had when he staged the transfer before the dinner. He believed the structure would hold. He had not accounted for internal friction. At 1:22, my phone rang again. Mason. I let it go to voicemail a second time. But this time, he didn't leave a message, which told me something had already shifted in his awareness, even if he didn't yet understand the source. At 2:02 p.m., I made the third move, smaller but more direct. I scheduled a consultation with a financial compliance attorney, not under my own name initially, but through a professional referral channel, providing only the necessary outline. Restricted beneficiary funds, unauthorized repurposing, and a pending capital transfer into a privately held entity. No accusations. Just structure. The earliest available slot was the following morning. I took it. That evening, I didn't open my laptop. Instead, I cooked dinner, something simple and quiet, letting the routine settle the edges of the day, because there are moments where nothing dramatic happens and yet everything shifts beneath the surface. While I ate, my phone lit up with a family group message from my mother, filled with photos from the previous night's dinner, smiling faces, full plates, Mason standing beside my father with a glass raised as if the evening had been a celebration rather than a reallocation. My name was not mentioned. No one asked where I was. I muted the thread without responding. At 8:16 p.m., my grandmother called. She didn't start with the dinner. She asked if I had eaten, if I was sleeping, if work was busy, moving through the conversation the way people do when they are approaching something they don't yet know how to say. I remember what your grandfather said about that money, she added finally, her voice quieter than usual. He was very clear. I know, I said. There was a pause, long enough for meaning to settle between us without being spoken directly. Your father thinks he's fixing something, she said. He doesn't always see the line between helping and taking. I know, I repeated. She didn't ask what I was going to do. I didn't tell her. We ended the call without resolution, but not without alignment. That mattered more. The next morning at 9:03 a.m., I sat across from the attorney in a glass-walled office that overlooked a row of quiet buildings, the kind of place where everything is documented and nothing moves without a record. I placed the trust clause and the LLC filing in front of him, not as evidence yet, but as structure. He read them carefully, once, then again. Did you sign anything authorizing this transfer? He asked. No. Did you provide written consent at any point? No. He leaned back slightly, considering. Then the issue isn't whether the funds were moved, he said. It's whether they were allowed to be moved in that way without triggering a breach of fiduciary duty. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. He tapped the document once. Lightly. If this is accurate, he continued, then whoever authorized the transfer may have assumed discretion where none existed. Assumed, I said. Or ignored, he corrected. The distinction was small, but it changed the weight of the situation. What happens if the system flags the mismatch? I asked. He paused for a moment, choosing his words. Then the burden shifts, he said. They would need to justify the transfer under conditions that don't appear to exist here, and until that's resolved, any downstream use of those funds becomes unstable. Unstable. That was the first word that matched exactly what I had been building toward. I gathered the documents, thanked him, and left without scheduling a follow-up, because the next steps were already in motion, and additional discussion would only slow the process. By the time I returned to my car, my phone had 3 missed calls, all from my father. I didn't answer. Not yet, because the system hadn't finished responding. But it had already started. The system responded faster than my father expected, and faster than I had planned for. Because once a restricted source is forced into verification, it stops behaving like private money and starts behaving like a liability. At 8:42 a.m., the LLC registry issued a formal notice that my audit request had triggered a source validation review on the $75,000 capital entry tied to Mason's amended operating agreement, which meant the declared origin of the funds was now being cross-referenced against any legal constraints attached to it, including beneficiary restrictions that cannot be overridden by internal management claims. At 9:17, the second notice arrived. Provisional discrepancy identified. Supporting authorization required. The wording was minimal, but the implication was not, because the system had already detected that the capital contribution did not align cleanly with its supposed classification, which meant the burden had shifted from silent execution to documented justification. And documented justification requires something they did not have: written consent. At 9:51 a.m., the registry escalated the review status to conditional hold, a designation that does not freeze the entire account, but isolates the flagged amount, preventing it from being deployed into contracts, lease payments, or vendor settlements until the discrepancy is resolved, which in Mason's case immediately affected the only line of capital he was relying on to stabilize the business. That was the first real fracture, because his restaurant was not in a position to wait. The lease extension for the Oak Brook location required a confirmed payment of $28,500 by the end of the week, and the supplier lien sitting at $42,600 had already moved into formal demand status, which meant any delay in accessible funds would not just slow expansion, it would expose existing weakness. The $75,000 was not optional. It was critical. And now, it was restricted. At 10:06, my father called twice in quick succession, and when I didn't answer, he sent a message that was shorter than anything he had ever written to me. Did you file something? I didn't respond, because the answer was already moving through channels he couldn't intercept. At 10:48, the estate attorney's office confirmed that my inquiry had been escalated for internal review due to a potential breach of beneficiary restricted allocation, which was the first time the situation had been described using language that carried legal weight rather than administrative neutrality. Not a discrepancy, a breach. That single word changed the structure, because once a transfer is evaluated under breach conditions, every downstream use of those funds becomes exposed to reversal, and any party benefiting from that transfer becomes part of the risk chain, whether they initiated it or not. By 1:32 p.m., the effect reached Mason directly. The operating account flagged the $75,000 as restricted pending source validation, and an automatic notification was sent to the entity's managing member, my father, stating that any attempt to deploy those funds before clearance could trigger a compliance review at the state level, which in practical terms meant that if he tried to push the money through anyway, it would not just fail, it would escalate. At 2:11, Mason called again. This time he left a message. There's a hold on the account, he said, his voice tight, controlled but strained in a way that suggested he was already dealing with someone else on the other end of the problem. They're saying part of the funding isn't cleared. Dad said it's a system issue, but can you just tell me if you talked to someone? I listened once, then deleted it, because the system wasn't asking me anything. It was asking them. That evening, the family group chat activated again, but the tone had shifted from casual to cautious, with my mother asking whether anyone had heard from me, and my aunt responding with questions rather than assumptions. The first visible sign that the narrative my parents controlled at the dinner table was no longer holding cleanly under pressure. At 8:03 p.m., my father called again. This time, I answered. "Vanessa," he said without greeting, without transition, his voice already carrying the edge of someone who had spent the day responding instead of directing. "What did you do?" I leaned back slightly, letting the silence sit just long enough to register before answering. I asked a question. "To who?" "The person responsible for enforcing the terms." There was a pause, longer than before, and when he spoke again, the certainty from the dinner table was gone. "You're creating a problem that doesn't need to exist." "No," I said, my voice even, steady. "I'm identifying one that already does." "That money was under my control," he said, sharper now. "Under your management," I corrected. "Not outside its purpose." The distinction held. He didn't argue it. He couldn't. Because the system had already agreed with me. At 8:19, his tone shifted again, lower this time, more measured. "If this escalates," he said, "it affects more than just you." "I'm aware," I replied, and I was, because escalation no longer depended on what either of us said. It depended on what they could prove. And right now, they couldn't prove authorization. After the call ended, I placed my phone on the table and let the quiet return, not as relief, but as confirmation, because the structure had moved past the point where it could be contained through conversation. The money was restricted. The review was active. The classification had changed. And once a transfer becomes a breach, it doesn't stay contained. It spreads. By the next morning, the situation had moved beyond internal pressure and begun to affect obligations that could not be delayed without consequence. Because once a restricted transfer is formally reclassified, every dependency tied to it starts to shift in ways that are both visible and measurable. At 9:06 a.m., the registry issued a supplemental notice, confirming that the $75,000 capital entry in Mason's operating account had been placed under contested source status, a designation that effectively removed it from usable liquidity, while the verification process remained unresolved, which meant any payment scheduled against that amount now existed without a confirmed funding base. That shift did not remain contained for long. Within 30 minutes, the lease agreement tied to the Oakbrook location triggered an automated compliance alert, because the $28,500 payment due by Friday was no longer backed by cleared funds, and the property management system flagged the account as unsecured pending confirmation, a status that does not cancel the agreement but signals to the lessor that the tenant's financial position may not support the commitment as previously represented. It was a small change in classification, but it altered the perception of reliability. At 9:38, the estate attorney's office followed with a formal inquiry notice, confirming that a written response had been requested from the managing party responsible for the trust allocation, requiring documentation of beneficiary authorization or a legally valid exception permitting the reallocation, neither of which existed in the material I had already reviewed. That request introduced a different kind of pressure, because it required not just explanation, but documentation that could withstand external scrutiny. At 10:27, my father sent a message. Tinksaft. 10:07, my father sent a message after several unanswered calls. The tone controlled but compressed in a way that suggested he was no longer managing the situation, only reacting to it. "We need to resolve this privately before it affects everyone." I read it without responding. Not because I was avoiding the conversation, But because the situation had already moved beyond anything that could be contained privately, and responding at that moment would only give him the illusion that the outcome still depended on agreement rather than structure. By 11:52, the impact reached the supplier side of Mason's business, where the $42,600 lien that had been filed weeks earlier entered a new phase. As the pending payment tied to that obligation was flagged under conditional delay due to insufficient verified funds, prompting a notification to the supplier that payment confirmation could not be guaranteed under current account conditions. That was the point where the pressure became operational. Not theoretical. Not procedural. Operational. Because both the lease and the supplier were now reacting to the same absence of confirmed liquidity, and neither of them had a reason to wait indefinitely for a resolution that depended on a verification process. My father could not accelerate. At 1:36 p.m., Mason called again, and this time I answered, not because I needed information, but because the structure had reached a stage where clarity no longer shifted control. "Vanessa," he said, his voice controlled but tight, the strain visible in the way he moved between sentences without finishing them cleanly. "Everything is getting flagged at the same time, and no one is giving me a straight answer." "They are," I said. "You just don't like it." There was a pause, short but heavy. "They're saying the funding isn't cleared," he continued. "That doesn't make sense. It came from our account." "It came through your account," I corrected. "That's not the same thing." Another pause followed, longer this time, as the distinction settled. "If this doesn't clear in the next 2 days, I lose the lease," he said, his voice lower now, more measured, as if stating it carefully might reduce its impact. "I know. And if the supplier escalates, they can freeze operations," he added. "I know." He exhaled, slower this time, the sound of someone moving from confusion into recognition. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. It was not the question my father had asked. It was more direct, more accurate. "Nothing," I said. "That's not an answer." "It is," I replied. "Because this isn't something you fix by acting. It's something that resolves when it's authorized correctly. And if it's not, then it doesn't resolve." The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones, because it no longer carried uncertainty, but understanding, even if he didn't agree with it yet. At 2:18, the call ended without resolution, and I returned to my work as if nothing had changed, because from my position, nothing had every step that needed to move was already in motion, and additional action would only disrupt the timing. That evening, I stopped at the grocery store on the way home, moving through the same routine I always did, selecting the same items, waiting in the same line, while somewhere else, the structure that had been quietly relied on for years was tightening in ways that could no longer be adjusted through conversation. When I got home, the apartment was quiet in the familiar way it always was, my cat waiting near the door, the kitchen exactly as I had left it, and for a few minutes, nothing in my immediate environment reflected the scale of what was unfolding elsewhere. I made dinner, sat at the table, and let the absence of noise settle, because there are moments where nothing outwardly changes, and yet the weight of a decision becomes fully visible in what is no longer being said. The family group chat remained silent. No updates, no explanations, no attempt to reframe the situation, which, in a family that normally filled every space with controlled narrative, was its own form of confirmation. By 8:22 p.m., I checked the latest status update. The funds remained under restriction. The lease was still unsecured. The supplier had not been paid, and the inquiry remained unresolved. Nothing had been reversed. Nothing had been stabilized, which meant the pressure had no available exit. And when pressure has no exit, it doesn't disappear. It accumulates. By the second day, the pressure stopped spreading quietly and began to reorganize the structure around it. Because once multiple obligations depend on a single blocked source, the system does not simply wait. It recalculates risk and adjusts behavior in real time. At 8:58 a.m., A formal notice was issued from the property management group overseeing the Oakbrook lease, not terminating the agreement but shifting its status to conditional enforcement, which required proof of cleared funds within 48 hours or the initiation of default procedures, a clause that had been standard in the contract from the beginning but had never been activated until the account lost its verified liquidity. That notice didn't arrive in isolation. It was accompanied by a request for confirmation of funding source, which meant the lessor was no longer satisfied with the existence of capital on paper but required assurance that the capital itself was unrestricted and deployable, a distinction that most tenants never encounter unless something in the structure triggers concern. At 9:22, the supplier escalated their position. The $42,600 lien moved from pending demand to active enforcement preparation, and a preliminary notice was issued indicating that if payment confirmation was not received within 72 hours, they would proceed with formal recovery actions, including potential disruption of ongoing supply agreements. 2 deadlines. Same dependency, neither adjustable. At 10:11, the estate attorney's office sent a follow-up communication stating that no valid authorization had yet been provided by the managing party, and that failure to produce documentation within the review window could result in the matter being formally classified as a breach of fiduciary duty, which would extend the scope of the review beyond administrative correction into legal accountability. That was the moment the structure shifted again. Because administrative pressure can be negotiated, legal exposure cannot. At 10:34, my father called. I let it ring once, then answered. His voice was different this time, stripped of the authority he had used at the dinner table, replaced with something more controlled, more deliberate, as if he were choosing each word carefully to avoid triggering something he could no longer predict. They're overreacting, he said. This can be resolved if you clarify that you're aware of the transfer. I am aware, I replied. That's not what I mean, he said, his tone tightening slightly. They need confirmation that you're not contesting it. I didn't initiate a contest, I said. I initiated a verification. There was a pause. Then confirm it's fine, he said. That's all they need. I leaned back slightly, letting the silence extend just enough to register the shift in position, because 2 days earlier, he had announced the transfer as a completed decision, and now he was asking for something he had never considered necessary. You're asking for retroactive authorization, I said. I'm asking you to stop this from escalating, he replied. It already escalated when the funds were moved without consent, I said. Another pause. Longer this time. If this is classified as a breach, he said slowly, it affects the entire structure, not just that account. I'm aware, I said again. And I was. Because the review no longer existed in isolation. It was connected to the trust, the LLC, and every transaction that depended on the legitimacy of that transfer. What do you want? He asked. It was the second time that question had been asked. It carried more weight now. Correct classification, I said. That's not a real answer. It is, I replied. Because if the classification is wrong, everything built on it is unstable. At 11:02, the call ended without agreement, and for the first time he didn't call back immediately, which told me he had reached the limit of what direct conversation could change. By early afternoon, the system responded again. At 1:18 p.m., a preliminary breach flag was applied to the transfer under review. Not a final determination, but a classification that allowed related entities to adjust their exposure proactively, which meant any party connected to the funds could now take protective action without waiting for a final ruling. The effect was immediate. The property management group updated the lease status to at risk, and the supplier initiated partial suspension protocols on future deliveries, not halting operations entirely, but reducing their commitment until payment certainty was restored. Nothing collapsed. But nothing moved forward either. At 2:07, Mason called again. This time, his voice was different. Less defensive. More direct. They're not waiting anymore, he said. The lease team wants proof by tomorrow, and the supplier is pulling back on inventory. I know, I said. They're saying the money might not clear at all, he continued. If that happens, it doesn't clear, I said. Unless it's authorized. Silence followed. Then a quieter question. If I ask you directly, he said, will you approve it? I didn't answer immediately. Not because I needed time, but because the question itself marked the shift I had been waiting for. From assumption to request. From control to dependency. Not like this, I said finally. What does that mean? It means the structure has to be corrected first, I replied. And if it isn't, then the outcome stays where it is. At 2:31, the call ended. No argument. No escalation. Just understanding. That evening, I didn't check the registry immediately. I let the time pass, allowing the system to continue its process without interference. Because at this stage, timing mattered more than speed, and any attempt to accelerate resolution would reduce the clarity of the outcome. When I finally reviewed the status at 8:46 p.m., the position was unchanged in classification but intensified in effect. The funds remained restricted. The breach flag remained active. The deadlines were closer, and the responses from the other side were becoming less controlled, less certain, and more reactive with each passing hour. Nothing had broken yet, but the structure was no longer holding. It was shifting under weight it had not been designed to carry. By the third day, the system stopped adjusting around the pressure and began to enforce outcomes. Because once deadlines tied to restricted funds expire without resolution, the structure does not wait for correction. It moves forward based on what is verifiable, not what was intended. At 8:12 a.m., the Oakbrook lease shifted from conditional enforcement into formal default. As the 48-hour window closed without confirmed liquidity, and the property management group executed the clause that allowed them to withdraw the extension offer entirely, reopening the unit to other tenants without further obligation to hold the space, which meant the opportunity Mason had been presenting as secured, was no longer paused or delayed, but removed from the structure altogether. The system did not acknowledge intent. It recognized only confirmed funding. At 9:03, the supplier advanced their position in parallel. As the 72-hour demand period expired without payment confirmation, triggering the transition from pending lien to active recovery, which authorized them to initiate formal collection procedures and restrict future deliveries, effectively reducing Mason's ability to operate at normal capacity while the outstanding balance remained unresolved. Both dependencies had now moved beyond negotiation. They were executing their own terms. At 9:47, the estate attorney's office issued the determination notice that finalized the internal classification. Transfer classified under breach of fiduciary duty pending corrective action. The phrasing was precise and deliberate, because it did not suggest uncertainty or review, but established that the action itself had violated the conditions under which the funds were held, which meant the focus was no longer on whether the transfer could be justified, but on how it would be corrected. That distinction carried weight across every connected layer. At 10:18, the LLC registry updated the capital entry from contested to invalid pending correction, a change that removed the $75,000 from recognized operational capital within the entity, effectively stripping the amended operating agreement of its funding basis and exposing the expansion plan as unsupported under current conditions. The number still appeared in the documents, but it no longer functioned within the system. At 10:52, my father called, and when I answered, the difference in his tone was immediate, because the distance he had maintained at the dinner table was gone, replaced by a direct urgency that no longer attempted to frame the situation as controlled. "This needs to be corrected," he said, his voice tight but measured, as if precision could contain what was already moving beyond him. "They've classified it as a breach, and that affects everything connected to it. It affects what was built on it," I said. It affects the entire structure, he replied quickly, the shift from control to reaction now visible in the pace of his words. If this stays on record, it creates exposure we don't need. It reflects what happened, I said. There was a pause, longer than before, not because he lacked a response, but because the framing no longer aligned with what he could adjust. You can resolve this, he said finally. If you provide authorization, it closes the review and restores the classification. It changes the record, I replied. Not the action. It stabilizes the situation, he insisted. It removes the consequence, I said. The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones, because it no longer carried argument, but recognition of position. And when he spoke again, his voice had lowered, not in authority, but in calculation. This affects more than just me, he said. It affects your mother. It affects the business. It affects the family. I let the statement settle before answering, not because I needed time, but because the sequence was already complete. It already did, I said. At 11:26, the call ended without agreement, and this time he did not call back, which marked the point where conversation stopped being a tool and became irrelevant to the outcome. By early afternoon, the external consequences extended beyond immediate transactions and into broader visibility. At 1:14 p.m., an update was filed against Mason's business credit profile, reflecting the escalated supplier action, which meant any attempt to secure alternative financing would now be evaluated under increased risk conditions, limiting access to short-term capital that might have otherwise offset the disruption. At 2:03, the Oak Brook property listing reappeared publicly as available, with no reference to prior negotiations, effectively erasing the assumption that the location had ever been secured and signaling to the market that the opportunity had been released. The system did not preserve intent. It recorded outcome. At 2:41, Mason called. And when I answered, his voice carried none of the urgency from the previous day, only a quiet acknowledgement that the structure he had relied on was no longer holding. They pulled the lease, he said. I saw. The supplier's moving forward, he added, his tone steady but subdued. I know. There was a pause, longer this time, not filled with resistance, but with the absence of it. I didn't think it would reach this point, he said. That's because it wasn't structured to hold without authorization, I replied. Another pause followed, softer now. Was there a way to stop it? He asked. I considered the question briefly, not to soften the answer, but to keep it accurate. Yes, I said, before the transfer was executed. The line remained open for a moment, as if he expected an alternative to follow. But there wasn't one, because the outcome had not been created in a single moment, but through a sequence that could only be interrupted earlier, not reversed later. At 3:02, he ended the call. That evening, the family group chat reactivated, but the pattern had changed, with short, uncertain messages replacing the controlled narrative from earlier days. My aunt asking direct questions, my mother responding without detail, and my father remaining silent, which in itself marked a shift from authority to absence. At 7:38, my grandmother sent a single message. He should have asked. No one responded. The sentence remained, unchallenged, carrying more weight than anything said at the dinner table. By 8:21 p.m., I reviewed the final status updates for the day, noting that the lease had been released, the supplier action had advanced, the capital entry remained invalid, and the breach classification continued to define the structure, leaving no remaining element in a pending or reversible state. The system had completed its process. The pressure had resolved into outcome, and what remained was no longer negotiable. By the fourth day, nothing in the structure was moving anymore, because every element that could escalate had already reached its outcome, leaving only correction and record, both of which operate without negotiation once the system has defined the terms. At 9:05 a.m., The estate attorney's office issued the final directive, requiring the $78,000 allocation tied to my name to be restored to its original restricted classification, with any transferred portion subject to reversal unless supported by documented beneficiary consent, which had never been provided, making the responsibility for correction entirely internal to the party that had authorized the movement. The language was precise, not suggestive, and it did not leave space for reinterpretation, because once a transfer is formally evaluated as a breach, the correction is no longer optional. It is required to restore the structure to compliance. At 9:42, the LLC registry confirmed the same position from a different angle, updating the capital entry to remain invalid until the discrepancy was resolved, and noting that any failure to correct the classification could extend the review into related transactions executed under the same authority, a detail that did not need emphasis to carry weight. The system had stopped asking questions. It was defining outcomes. At 10:18, my father called, and when I answered, there was no attempt to reframe the situation, no effort to return to the tone he had used at the dinner table, only a controlled acknowledgement of what had already been established. "They've issued the correction notice," he said, his voice steady but quieter than before, as if the effort required to maintain certainty had already been spent. "We'll reverse the transfer and restore the account. You'll restore the allocation," I said. A brief pause followed. Not resistance, but adjustment. "Yes," he said, "and document it correctly." There was nothing else to add. At 11:07, Mason sent a message confirming that the amended operating agreement had been withdrawn, and that the $75,000 entry would be removed from the entity, leaving the expansion plan without the capital it had depended on, but bringing the structure back into alignment with what had always been defined. By early afternoon, the first confirmation appeared in the registry, showing the corrected filing in place, followed shortly by acknowledgement from the estate attorney's office that the funds would be reinstated under their original restrictions once returned, with the breach classification updated to "resolved with correction," preserving the record without leaving the matter open. Nothing was erased. It was simply put back where it belonged. That evening, I returned home at the same time as always, set my keys on the table, and moved through the apartment without thinking about the process that had just concluded. Because nothing in my space had changed. And yet the absence of pressure made everything feel more defined, as if something that had always been slightly misaligned had finally settled into place. I fed my cat, rinsed a glass, and stood at the kitchen counter while the water heated, watching the quiet fill the room in a way that didn't ask anything from me, didn't require explanation, didn't carry expectation. At 6:48 p.m., my phone lit up with a message from my mother. "We've fixed the situation. I hope we can move forward." I read it once and set the phone aside. Not because I was avoiding a response, but because the sentence did not require one, and anything I said would suggest that the outcome had been a conversation rather than a correction. At 7:12, another message arrived, this time from my grandmother. "You were right to ask." I left that one unanswered too, not out of distance, but because it was already complete. Later that night, I opened the document again. The same clause that had existed long before the dinner, long before the transfer, long before anyone decided it could be treated as flexible. Funds may not be repurposed for non-educational use without explicit written consent of the named beneficiary. The wording had not changed, only the assumption around it had. I closed the file and turned off the light, leaving the apartment in the same quiet it had always held. Except now it felt different. Not because something had been taken back, but because nothing had ever truly been given away. They hadn't returned it. They had only corrected what was never theirs to move. And that had always been enough.